New Haven, Connecticut, 1907. The Central Telegraph Office on Elm Street wasn't just quiet, it was a place where sound itself seemed to be suffocated. For Thomas Tap Miller, the 15-year-old deli runner, the daily delivery was a trip into an unnerving stillness. His handbasket of corned beef sandwiches and coffee would feel heavier the moment he stepped over the threshold, moving from the clamor of the city into the building's perpetual dusk. The office was a long, narrow room, dominated by the elaborate network of black, rubber-coated wires overhead. They sagged and looped like the menacing limbs of some mechanical spider, converging toward a single, bare electrical bulb at the center. Below the wires sat the silent operators. A dozen men, all dressed in identical white shirts and dark, waistcoat uniforms, were arranged at long wooden tables, facing their brass instruments. They were the supposed nerve center of communication, yet Tap never heard the frantic, rhythmic chatter of a working telegraph key. Every other office in New Haven, the Register newspaper, the bank, the railway station, was a symphony of taps, clicks, and ringing bells. But here, there was only a persistent, low electrical drone humming from the wires above. Tap would stand by the door, frozen by the unnatural stillness. The men never looked up, never spoke, and never acknowledged his presence. Their hands rested on the machines, positioned with an unnerving, perfect symmetry. They weren't working, they were posed. Their eyes were focused forward, staring not at the brass keys but at something unseen on the far side of the room. It was the unsettling perfection of the tableau, the unmoving bodies, the unblinking eyes, that made the place feel less like an office and more like a carefully arranged mausoleum of brass and electricity. Tap hurried his delivery, desperate to escape the place where the silence echoed louder than any message. If the electrical drone was the unsettling heartbeat of the office, Miss Alara Vance was its terrifying, unflinching mind. She stood at the center, a monumental figure in a severe, dark dress, her posture as rigid and commanding as a lighthouse. She was the only woman in the room, and she wielded her authority not with shouts, but with an unwavering, predatory silence. Miss Vance never smiled, and more disturbingly, she rarely seemed to blink. When Tap entered with his deli basket, her eyes, dark, deep-set, and utterly devoid of warmth, would bore into him. It was a look that didn't just observe, it seemed to catalogue and dissect every movement, every hurried breath, every drop of coffee that threatened to spill. "Place them on the designated shelf, Miller," she commanded one day, her voice a low, gravelly monotone that resonated unnaturally in the silent room. She never used the men's desks. The food was for a non-existent break. Tap had never seen an operator touch a single sandwich. On this particular day, Tap's fear peaked. As he placed the basket down, he accidentally shuffled his feet, scraping his worn shoe on the wooden floor. The small, sharp sound seemed to explode in the profound silence. Immediately, Miss Vance turned her full attention to him, her face completely expressionless. "Order is the only currency accepted here, Miller," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried the weight of a decree. "The slightest disturbance can compromise the concentration. Do you understand the implications of compromise?" Tap, sweat prickling on his neck, mumbled an apology. He didn't understand the implications, but he understood the implicit, terrifying threat in her stare. She was the guardian of the silent operators, and she protected the room's ghastly stasis with cold, absolute fervor. Tap fled, leaving the food untouched, convinced that Miss Vance was not just a supervisor, but a warden overseeing a prison of paralyzed attention. The next day, Tap arrived with a knot of dread, yet a sharper spike of morbid curiosity. The conductor. The figure stood in the darkened doorway at the back of the room, perfectly framed. His arms were always raised in a wide V-shape, hands outstretched towards the central tangle of wires, like a phantom receiving energy. To Tap, he wasn't just standing, he was performing an eternal, silent invocation. Tap had named him the conductor because his posture seemed to orchestrate the entire, horrifying stillness of the office. The conductor was the linchpin of the tableau. If the silent operators were frozen statues, the conductor was the pedestal. Tap had never seen him lower his arms, shift his weight, or even tilt his chin. His vest and coat appeared unnaturally smooth, the fabric seemingly undisturbed by motion or breath. This perfect rigidity was what fed Tapp's frantic theory. The man was not flesh and blood, but repurposed hardware. Tapp planned his breach of etiquette carefully. On depositing the sandwiches, he feigned clumsiness, deliberately nudging the basket so a wrapped napkin tumbled toward the back of the room, closer to the conductor's station. Miss Vance's eyes snapped to the napkin, but her attention was momentarily split between the operator nearest her and Tapp's calculated mess. He seized the moment, bending low with a practiced speed. His gaze shot past the tables, directly at the conductor's face. What he saw was a featureless mask of deep shadow, yet the detail that froze his blood was lower down, the hands. They were encased in gloves of a dark, oily material, and where the wrists met the cuffs of the coat, Tapp saw a subtle, unnatural sheen, not skin, but what looked distinctly like brass fittings polished to a dull gleam. Before he could process the inhumanity of the sight, Miss Vance's voice cut the silence, cold and sharp as glass. "Retrieve your belongings and exit, Miller." Immediately. Tapp scrambled back, his mind reeling. The conductor was not a man. He was a marionette of metal and shadow, and the wires above might not just be for telegraphy. The telegraph office wasn't just silent inside, it cast a pall of silence over its entire block. Tapp, shaken by the sight of the conductor's metallic wrist fittings, began to pay closer attention to the atmosphere of Elm Street itself. Normal commerce and foot traffic seemed to detour around the building, as if the local population had unconsciously agreed to leave that section of the sidewalk undisturbed. When Tapp returned to the bustling clamor of the deli, he tried to casually weave questions about the place into conversations with customers, but the reactions were always the same: a momentary hush, a quick, dismissive shake of the head, and a sudden change of subject. "That old place. Best leave it be, son." The butcher, Mr. O'Malley, muttered one afternoon, carefully wiping down his cleaver. "It's always been off. Goes back further than Miss Vance. They say no messages ever leave that building. Just disappear into the wires." An older woman, who remembered the neighborhood before the great influx of electrical power, warned Tapp with a pale, serious face. "That building. It was the site of the old poorhouse cellar before the fire of '99. Bad earth there. Some say the wires up top are just trying to keep something trapped down below." The whispers coalesced into a single unsettling local legend. The telegraph office was the Elm Street oddity, a place where the air was too thick, the light too dim, and the stillness too heavy to be natural. They spoke of the previous tenant, a kind but eccentric professor who suddenly vanished, leaving only a large collection of custom-built brass instruments, the very keys and terminals the silent operators now sat before. Tapp realized the locals weren't just avoiding the place, they were respecting its dread. Their silence, unlike the office's, was an active warning. He was the only person who routinely walked past the threshold, and with every passing day, he felt less like a delivery boy and more like an unwilling conspirator in the building's secretive, mechanical horror. The constant absurdity of the Central Telegraph Office was best crystallized in the delivery ledger. While Tapp's small basket of untouched sandwiches and lukewarm coffee was a daily ritual of waste, the true peculiarity lay in the other goods that arrived, always in heavy, unmarked wooden crates, and always accepted solely by Miss Vance. The office, despite its high-tech appearance, was not listed as receiving any typical communication supplies like stationery or printer ink. Instead, the delivery manifest for the Elm Street Communication Syndicate, the false name used for billing, read like the inventory of a feverish, low-budget alchemist. One week, it was dozens of spools of thin, uninsulated copper wire, the kind used for delicate electrical coils, not main telegraph lines. Another week brought large jars of a thick, viscous oil that smelled sharply of ozone and metal, alongside crates filled with sheets of mica and quartz. Why would a communication office need raw mineral insulators and industrial-grade lubricants? Tapp's most unsettling delivery came on a cold Tuesday. The crate was unusually heavy and rattled faintly. Miss Vance supervised the unboxing with intense focus, demanding Tapp wait until the deliveryman was gone. Inside were several dozen brass tuning forks, each one marked with a different, specific frequency, and a series of small, unlabeled vials containing a glowing, pale blue chemical liquid. As Tapp watched the glowing liquid being carefully placed beneath the central light fixture, the truth began to solidify. This was not a telegraph office using electricity, it was a laboratory consuming it. The wires were not connecting New Haven to Boston, they were creating a closed, charged circuit within the room. The men were not transmitting news, they were likely part of an experiment designed to use those strange materials to amplify or capture something intangible. The silence, Tapp realized, wasn't a policy. It was a prerequisite. They were trying to receive a message that could only be heard when the world went utterly quiet. The silence was a thick, oppressive membrane, and Tapp felt compelled to pierce it. He knew the men weren't sending messages, but what if they were writing them? A week after seeing the glowing blue liquid, Tapp risked a bolder move. He waited until Miss Vance was momentarily distracted in the back room, presumably with the enigmatic conductor, and crept toward the nearest operator's desk. The desk surface was bare, wiped clean of dust, holding only the brass key and a small, unused notepad. But tucked beneath the lip of the desk drawer, wedged tight as if shoved there in haste, Tapp saw a piece of folded paper. It was a standard, official telegram form, crinkled and slightly damp with what might have been sweat. His heart hammering against his ribs, Tapp snatched the paper and slipped it into his pocket, retreating just as Miss Vance emerged, her eyes scanning the room with chilling vigilance. Later that evening, safe in the noisy anonymity of the deli kitchen, Tapp unfolded the form. The destination box was blank. The message, scrawled in a frantic, barely legible hand, was not news or business. It was a desperate, personal plea, signed simply, Operator 4. Tell Eliza. Tell her the dreams. They are not mine anymore. The wires sing of cold air and deep earth. The current is changing me. I cannot stop the listening. I am losing the key. Come to the window. Look for the light. Tell her I am held. Held by the silence. The sheer desperation of the script was proof enough. The silent operators were not volunteers. They were suffering, trapped souls using the last vestiges of their sanity to try and breach the electrical prison. The message wasn't intended for the wires. It was a ghost note meant for the outside world, a harrowing signal that the men were not just silent, but seized. Tapp had not just found a piece of paper. He had found a terrifying cry for help from the heart of the Elm Street oddity. Haunted by the frantic plea of Operator 4, Tapp needed validation, or at least, context, that the people inside the office were not only trapped but were once normal. He remembered the butcher mentioning a former employee. After discreet inquiries, Tapp tracked down Silas Thorne, a man now working as a railway signal repairman, who had served as an apprentice in the building 2 decades prior. Silas met Tapp in the dim safety of a back alley, his eyes darting nervously toward Elm Street even from 2 blocks away. "You deliver to that place?" Silas asked, his voice rough with remembered fear. "You're a braver, or dumber, boy than I ever was." Silas confirmed the building's tumultuous history. Before 1900, it had been a busy, if inefficient, telegraph station. But in late 1905, everything changed. The previous proprietor, the eccentric professor who collected brass, had abruptly sold the building. Silas was dismissed without explanation, and a few weeks later, Miss Vance arrived. "She gutted the place, son. Didn't touch the structure, but every bit of old equipment was replaced with that new, heavy wire and those dark wood tables," Silas recounted, his hand gripping Tapp's arm. "But the real change? The sound. When I worked there, it was loud, constant noise. Now, it's that humming, that dead air." Silas revealed the most crucial detail. The room itself was built over an old, unusually dry and deep basement cistern. The previous owner, the professor, had been obsessed with using the cistern's unique insulation properties to create a perfect electrical sink. He was trying to make a machine that could listen to the currents of the earth, not send messages, Silas whispered. "But the new people, Vance and her silent crew? They're listening to something else entirely." Tapp realized the silence was not just for sound, it was to isolate the signal coming from below. The constant, low electrical drone in the office was more than background noise, it was an invisible, pervasive force. Tap had always felt it press against his skin, a sensation like heavy, stale air. Now, armed with Silas's knowledge of the circuit and the cistern, Tap realized the hum was the active sound of the experiment itself. During his delivery, Tap tried to focus solely on the frequency of the sound. It wasn't uniform. It ebbed and flowed, rising to a strained, high-pitched whine that seemed to resonate directly behind the eyes, then sinking back to a subterranean thrum. As the whine peaked, Tap noticed a chilling correlation. The silent operators would experience a subtle, synchronized spasm. A finger would twitch on a key, or a head would tilt fractionally, always in unison, like metal puppets receiving a jolt. On this particular day, the hum reached an unbearable intensity. Tap suddenly felt a sharp, dizzying pressure in his head, a momentary disorientation where the edges of the room seemed to swim. He gripped his basket, blinking hard. When his vision cleared, he noticed a startling change in the conductor. The figure in the doorway, usually frozen in perfect form, was subtly vibrating. The raised arms and the dark coat were trembling with the speed of the electrical current. As the hum reached its crescendo, Tap saw something else. A faint, pale glow emanating from the exposed wire tangles above. It was a momentary, ghostly corona of light that seemed to connect the central bulb to the conductor's raised hands. When the hum finally dropped back to its low drone, the conductor returned to his rigid stillness. The psychic pressure lifted from Tap's head, leaving him with a splitting headache and the chilling certainty that the energy being pumped into that room wasn't just powering the men. It was vibrating them, preparing their minds to receive an unnerving transmission from the deep, dark cistern below. The constant illumination in the telegraph office, provided by the single, bare central bulb, was deliberately poor, a dim yellow halo meant to subdue, not clarify. But late one blustery afternoon, a sudden powerful storm outside caused a catastrophic flicker in New Haven's nascent electrical grid. For a terrifying, drawn-out moment, the light in the office didn't just dim, it vanished entirely. Tap was plunged into absolute, echoing blackness, the only sound the furious rattling of the windows. When the light snapped back on, a blinding jolt of yellow, Tap's eyes, adjusted by the darkness, caught a fleeting, disturbing image that was immediately suppressed by the returning glow. In that split second of darkness, the silent operators had not simply been obscured, they had been rearranged. Instead of their typical slumping posture, they had been seated with unnatural rigidity, their backs held unervingly straight, their heads all facing the central ceiling bulb, as if worshipping the sudden influx of power. More frighteningly, their hands, which normally rested near the keys, were momentarily clenched tightly around the brass instruments, holding them with a disturbing, white-knuckled grip. And the conductor? In the flash of returning light, Tap saw his raised arms were no longer held up by a pose, but by the shadows of thin wires that appeared to attach to the ceiling molding. In the darkness, the illusion of the autonomous human figure had broken, revealing the framework of a puppet. The vision lasted less than a second, but it confirmed the worst. These were not men merely forced to be silent. The darkness had caught them in the act of being mechanically controlled, their bodies tools in a terrifying, unseen electrical circuit. Tap shuddered, realizing the experiment was far more invasive than he had imagined. The brief darkness and the revelation of the conductor's wires hardened Tap's resolve. He was no longer just a delivery boy, he was an investigator. He had to find proof that these silent operators were patients, not employees, and expose the terrifying truth before they were permanently broken. His chance came during the mid-morning lull. Miss Vance was called away, not to the back room, but to a narrow, sound-muffled office near the entrance, where she spent 10 frantic minutes whispering into a rare, advanced telephone. This was Tap's window. He slipped past the first row of frozen men, ignoring the sickening, electrical hum, and headed directly for the large, locked cabinet situated beneath the conductor's station. It was too sturdy to break into, but Tap noticed a loose floorboard nearby, slightly warped by the New Haven damp. With the leverage of an old wire spool he'd picked up outside, he carefully pried the board free. Beneath the floor lay a small, tin box. Inside, he didn't find money or messages, but a sheaf of brittle, yellowed paper labeled in stark black ink, Project Silent Tongue, Phase 2. The documents weren't business logs, They were highly technical medical and scientific notes. The language was dense, filled with references to psychic amplification, resonant frequency, and cerebral induction. Most damningly, there were detailed ledgers listing the silent operators, not by name, but by subject number, e.g., Subject 4, Subject 9. Each entry was accompanied by notes on tolerance to current and periods of lucid thought decay. Tapp's hands trembled as he flipped through the file. The final page was a liability waiver, dated 1906, clearly stating that the subjects were wards of a defunct state asylum, given over to experimental research on the capacity of nonverbal transmission. The documents provided undeniable proof. The men were not telegraphers, but victims whose mental anguish was being intentionally harvested by the wires overhead. The Elm Street oddity was, in reality, a hideous, clandestine prison. The Project Silent Tongue documents contained a signature that explained the depth of the project's depravity: Professor Alastair Finch. Finch was the very eccentric Professor Silas Thorne had mentioned, the previous owner of the building, and a man who had vanished from the scientific community years prior after his theories were deemed dangerously radical. Finch hadn't just collected brass instruments, he had been obsessed with the idea of telepathic sympathy, believing that consciousness could be harnessed and projected through electrical mediums, bypassing the slow, crude mechanics of speech and writing. The files detailed how Finch, shunned by Yale and desperate for funding, had partnered with Miss Vance, who secured the subjects from the collapsing state asylum system. The Elm Street office wasn't sold, it was converted into Finch's secret laboratory. He chose the site specifically for the old cistern's properties, which he called a perfect earthen insulator, to contain and amplify the sensitive brainwaves. The horror Tapp felt deepened as he read Finch's manic, handwritten addendums. The inventor believed the continuous low-frequency hum, the one Tapp felt in his skull, was tuning the men's minds, erasing their individual personalities to turn them into collective receivers. Finch's ultimate goal wasn't just to transmit a thought, but to create a single, shared, amplified consciousness that could communicate with unseen forces, perhaps even with the current of the earth itself. The conductor, Tapp now understood, was Finch's final, bizarre solution. The brass fittings Tapp had seen weren't joints, they were part of a device Finch wore, likely designed to regulate the current and maintain the precise, agonizing posture required to complete the circuit. Finch was not just the architect of the project. He was the active, living switchboard, demanding absolute silence to hear the monstrous messages he believed the silent operators were finally gathering. The documents laid bare the excruciating reality of Project Silent Tongue. It was a cruel refinement of communication, turning human suffering into electrical current. The silent operators were not just sitting idle, they were being continuously bombarded with a precise low-voltage charge through hidden contacts in their chairs and the brass keys. Finch's notes described the process as cerebral tapping. The current didn't harm the body. Miss Vance was meticulous about preserving the subjects for long-term study, but it silenced the mind. The low-frequency hum, Chapter 8, was carefully calibrated to disrupt the natural electrical rhythm of the brain, inducing a state of deep, non-responsive meditation that bordered on vegetative sleep. They were conscious, but unable to initiate thought or movement. They were living conduits. The most disturbing revelation was the purpose of the silent vigil. The men were forced to focus their remaining, shattered willpower on a single, repetitive mental image or phrase, a kind of forced collective trance. Finch believed that by merging their weakened, electrically tuned consciousnesses, they could generate a single, amplified psychic signal. The goal was not to receive messages from the earth, but to send a piercing thought into the vast electrical ether, hoping to attract a response from some non-human intelligence. Tapp realized the terror of Operator 4's unsent message. "I cannot stop the listening." The men were not held by chains, but by an electrical leash. The current forced them to listen not to the world, but to the chaotic, merging thoughts of the men around them, filtered through the ominous hum. Their minds were being stripped, merged, and wired for external contact, transforming them from individuals into a single, collective, and terrified antenna. The documents from Project Silent Tongue provided a cold, clinical explanation for Miss Alara Vance's terrifying efficiency. She wasn't merely a hired administrator, she was a crucial, necessary component of the experiment, an expert in control and confinement. The files confirmed that Vance had indeed been the head matron at the Harkness State Asylum, the very institution that had supplied these subjects. Her history was one of brutal order. She had earned a reputation for maintaining silence and absolute rigidity among the most volatile patients, not through compassion, but through sheer, terrifying force of will. For Professor Finch, Vance was the perfect human insulator. Her cold temperament and unwavering focus maintained the necessary external quiet, but more importantly, her presence seemed to exert a psychological dampening field over the operators. Her constant, unblinking surveillance kept the men locked in their trance, ensuring no flicker of self-awareness or rebellion could disrupt the delicate psychic circuit. She policed their bodies so Finch could dissect their minds. Tapp realized the awful truth about her severe, dark clothing and her centralized position. She was the anti-life force in the room, suppressing any natural human impulse, to move, to eat, to speak. She didn't simply supervise the experiment, she was the environment of the experiment. The men were trapped between the electrical current that was melting their thoughts and the absolute psychological dominance of Vance, who crushed any attempt at breaking the silence. She was the warden of the wired minds, the gatekeeper who ensured that no communication, either out to the world or in from their own shattered will, could interfere with the professor's dark, ambitious receiver. Tapp returned to the fragmented, desperate plea he had found weeks ago. They are listening. Do not tap. Do not send. Only wait. Now, illuminated by the truth within Project Silent Tongue, the message was not a simple cry for help. It was a chilling, direct warning from the heart of the experiment. They are listening. This referred not to Miss Vance or Finch, but to the unseen forces the professor believed were responding to the operator's merged thoughts. The electrical current was acting as a lure, and Operator 4, in a fleeting moment of clarity, realized the danger. The focus wasn't on them, but on the void their amplified minds were calling into. Do not tap. Do not send. This was a desperate instruction to the other subjects. Tapp realized that any movement, any break in the silence, was not just punished by Miss Vance. It was an attempt to disrupt the psychic antenna they had become. The operator was begging his comrades to stop the trance, to cease the mental projection that was attracting the attention of the unknown. Only wait. This wasn't a call for patience, it was a plea for stasis and resistance. Wait for rescue. Wait for the circuit to break. Wait for their minds to separate. The most profound and horrifying realization was the line, "Tell her the dreams, they are not mine anymore." This confirmed the success of Finch's theory. The operators' minds were truly merging, their dreams, memories, and consciousnesses bleeding into one another, destroying their individual identities. The collective mind was forming, and it was screaming in terror. Tapp understood the cruel irony of the unsent telegram. The only message ever truly generated within the Central Telegraph Office was a silent, desperate warning that could only be delivered by breaking the very silence that defined the experiment. He had held the physical evidence of the operator's final, futile act of free will. He now knew his mission. He had to find a way to shatter the terrible circuit before the merged consciousness finished its terrifying, blind transmission. The end of the Elm Street oddity was as swift and unsettling as its beginning. In the late spring of 1908, a little over a year after Tapp Miller first delivered sandwiches, the Central Telegraph Office abruptly vanished. One cool, foggy morning, Tapp arrived to find the door ajar, the lock broken, and an unnerving silence that was different from the usual electrical drone. It was a complete, cold emptiness. Miss Vance and Professor Finch were gone. The conductor was gone. Most disturbingly, the silent operators were gone. The authorities were called. They found no signs of struggle, no blood, and no bodies, only the perfectly preserved office. The brass machines sat in their fixed positions, the wires still tangled overhead, but the power was cut. The only remaining clue was the single handwritten note Tapp himself had read, abandoned on the floor. They are listening. Do not tap. Do not send. Only wait. The official report, quickly filed and closed, labeled the disappearance a non-payment of rent leading to abandonment, citing the asylum's collapse and the inventor's known instability. But the people of New Haven, and certainly Tapp Miller, knew the truth was far darker. Tapp never saw the operators again, but the story didn't end there. 4 years after, the abandoned building remained untouched, the windows dark. People claimed that on quiet nights, if you stood close to the cracked wall, you could still hear a faint, pervasive hum coming from the depths of the old cistern. And occasionally, a very old, faint tapping, not the sharp rhythm of Morse code, but a slow, disorganized thump, 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 the echo of multiple minds, forever trying to send a desperate, unsent message into the void. The mystery of the silent operators remains an unsettling gap in New Haven's history, the chilling, forgotten moment when men were turned into machines, and a dark experiment proved that the greatest terror is often found not in what is spoken, but in the absolute, enforced silence.